Okay, Assalamualaikum and very good day, everyone. Today, our group will continue our discussion. Our title today is Interaction in Second Language Learning. Our group members is Friska, me, Ali Pazli, and Azlan. Okay, next. All right. I will presenting the introduction part. Okay, first of all, I will talk about the interaction hypothesis, um, where first we'll discuss about the first version of Long's interaction hypothesis in 1980, which shared the underlying assumptions of Krashen regarding the existence of some form of distinctive language acquisition mechanism, but shifted attention from comprehensible input as a means of stimulating acquisition towards more interactive aspects of second language discourse. And then he argued that in order for learners to obtain second language input, it was likely that ongoing conversational adjustment will be needed. Next slide. So, Long's early research stated that the research showed that the interaction between native speaker and non-native speaker during informal conversation or game playing were rich in meaning negotiation, including repetition, confirmation checks, and clarification requests. Therefore, he argued that this adjustment made second language speech more comprehensible and thus increased its usefulness for second language acquisition. Next slide. So the focus of our discussion today, it will focus on research regarding the relationship between second language interaction and second language acquisition, which focuses more on concepts from cognitive learning theory and language processing theory rather than Krashen's LAD. And then I will presenting the revised interaction hypothesis and also interaction and the learning of target second language in structure and vocabulary. And then Friska will present the role of feedback and the output hypothesis and role of prompts in corrective feedbacks. And Azlan will presenting the problem of noticing and learners' characteristic and engagement. Next slide. All right, the first part is the revised interaction hypothesis by Long, 1996. Next slide. All right. The original version of Long's interaction hypothesis studies whether engagement in meaning negotiation could be shown to make second language input more comprehensible to the learners. For example, a study by Pika et al. In 1987, where the researchers conducted a study on a group of learners where they were required to listen to instructions from a script reader to complete the task. The researcher had divided the learners into two groups, where one group was encouraged to ask for clarification from the script reader, and the second group was instructed to follow the instructions from assisted without assistant. And then the results showed that the learners who were permitted to take part in meaning negotiation were more successful than the other in completing the task accurately. Thus, Pika et al. Conclude that the interaction modification were indeed helpful in promoting second language comprehension. Next slide. And then Long in 1985 had also argued for a research agenda investigating whether interactional modification could be shown to promote second language acquisition in addition to second language comprehension. Therefore, in his later reformulation of the interaction hypothesis in 1996, he placed much more emphasis on how this process might work, proposing links between features of input and the linguistic environment with the learner's internal or cognitive factors. The long revised version of the interaction hypothesis reads as follows. He said that it is proposed that environment contribution to acquisition are mediated by selective attention and the learner's development second language processing capacity, and that these resources are brought together most usefully, although not exclusively during negotiation for meaning. And then negative feedback obtained from during negotiation, work or elsewhere may be facilitative for second language development, at least for vocabulary, morphology, and language-specific syntax, and essentially for learning specifiable first language and second language contrast. And this revised version of interaction hypothesis highlights negative feedback, which can be obtained through negotiated interaction, facilitates second language acquisition. Next slide. All right, next part, I will discuss about the interaction and the learning of target second language structures and vocabulary. In order to investigate whether involvement in interaction promotes second language acquisition, many researchers have conducted studies to ensure its success. This section will discuss about descriptive study about Oliver, 2000 and also experimental study by Mackey 1999 and John 2007. In the descriptive study, the researcher tried to trace whether learners either reuse second language vocabulary for structure, which have been the object of kind of negotiation, or recall this at a later time. Meanwhile, as for the experimental studies, the researcher running a pre-test to document how well the structure were known, providing some form of structured interactive experience as the experimental treatment, and then running one or more post-tests in addition to the interactive experience to document any additional learning. Next slide. All right. First, we will discuss about. I will discuss about the Oliver's descriptive study in 2000. All right. These studies is to investigate naturally occurring teacher-student interaction, and Oliver documented that. First, the overall frequency of negotiation and corrective feedback with learners of different ages. And second, the extent to which learners showed uptake of language points at issues. All right, the following conversation is some the examples of finding in Oliver's descriptive study. If you can see, the first, the teacher asked the student, "What did you do in the garden?" And then the non-native speaker student answered, "Cut the tree." And then the teacher asked again, "You cut the trees? Were there big trees or were there little bushes?" And the non-native speaker student answered, "Big trees." All right. From this conversation, we can see that the students, instead of he said the tree, big tree, but he said big trees, which is he put the s at the end of the tree. And then from this study, there are some weaknesses from a cognitive or linguistic perspective, where we don't know whether the non-native students really learning and applying a rule of plural s, or the non-native speaker student just imitating a global phrase, big trees. Next slide. All right, next is the experimental study by Mackey 1999. This test to test whether opportunity to interact and negotiate for meaning would boost the knowledge of questions formed among learners of English as a second language. Following this study, following the 6 stages acquisition sequence for question formation proposed by Pineman and Johnston in 1987, some of the participants were allowed to negotiate whether, some of the participants were allowed to negotiate meaning with the native speaker, while others were not. All participants carried out other tasks as pre-test and as post-test. Next slide. All right, this is the development stage for question formation by Pineman, Johnston, and Brantley. That this research is follow this kind of stage, where they have it have 6 stages, which is we can see that the first stage is the description is single word or formula. For example, sample utterance for children. And then the next stage, for second stage, declaration words order with no inversion and no fronting. For example, it is a monster in the right corner, and the boys throw the shoes, like that. And the stage for the stage 3, the question have the learners began to use the fronting in the question. For example, where the children are, or is the picture has 2 planets on top, like that. The fourth stage is inversion in WH and yes or no questions. For example, where is the sun? Is there fish in the water? And stage 5, inversion with WH question by using how. How do you get to Plaza Mulia, for example? And stage 6, complex question. For example, is better, is it? Or why can't you go? Like that. Next slide. Next slide. All right. Okay. This is the findings from the Mackey 1999 studies, where if you can see that in the pre-test, okay, the non-native speaker began the conversation by asking the question, "The meal is not there." And then the native speaker answered, "No, it's gone. What do you think happened?" And then the non-native speaker said, "Happened, the cat." And then the native speaker answered, "Do you think the cat ate it?" Okay. And then the next, the treatment, the non-native speaker asked, "What the animal do?" And then the native speaker answered, "There are no bears." And then the non-native speaker asked, "Your picture have these sad girls?" And then the native speaker answered, "Yes. What do you have in your picture?" Okay. In the post-test, okay, the non-native speaker began to use the WH question. For example, what do your picture have? Or what have the robber done? Okay. And if you can see in the pre-test, The question asked by the non-native speaker doesn't have a WH question, okay? And but in the treatment, it have a WH question, but still in the declarative sentence or declarative words. For example, you picture have this sad girl like that, and but in the post test, the non-native speaker began to use the WH question and also auxiliary words. For example, do or has, something like that. So from the findings, the learner who had engaged in interaction progressed one or more stages in second language question formation, while the other group failed to do so. This showed that taking part in interaction can facilitate second language development. All right, next. Okay, this is the third study by John, 2007. Okay, this study is actually the study deals with the learning of second language Korean, which involve in interpreting the impact of interaction and acquisition of particular linguistic subsystem. In this study, the tasks were designed to push the use of several different areas of Korean vocabulary and grammar, such as unfamiliar noun vocabulary, unfamiliar action word verbs vocabulary, object relative clauses, which in Korean precede the modified noun and are indicated by a verbal suffix, and also honorific subject verb agreement. Next slide. All right, the findings of this study, the learner who engaged in intensive interaction that required the use of different areas of linguistics acquired significant learning overall, while other groups did not. And John also suggests that high frequency of verb used in Korean discourse may have contributed to the particularly successful learning of this vocabulary domain, and that the learners may have been developmentally ready to learn object relative clauses. However, based on this study, John found that the learners are still weak in terms of honorific morphology. John discussed the possibility of this happening. Perhaps honorific are not sufficiently salient in discourse, or perhaps they, which is the learner, lack communicative value, or perhaps their social pragmatic value was not understood by the learner. Next slide. So, the conclusion of the discussion of the both of the studies, Mackey and Go 2007, as well as Mackey and Go 2007, as well as Keck et al. 2006, who have done a lot of experimental studies, conclude that engagement in second language interaction impacts positively on second language learning. And then interaction is just as likely to be effective for the acquisition of lexis as for the acquisition of morphosyntax. On the other hand, Mackey and Go 2007 conclude that interaction may require delayed post-test in order to provide stronger evidence for long-term learning of morphosyntax. However, both of them agree that the evidence base is still small and call for longer series of experimental studies before such question can be solved. Meanwhile, John 2007 clearly suggests that some area of morphosyntax are more learnable than others. All right. And then next will be presented by my friend Friska. Thank you.
Next, we will move on to the next topic, which is the role of feedback. As you can see from previous slides, we already saw some action of feedback. So first of all, what is feedback? Feedback is information provided by an agent regarding aspects of one's performance or understanding, by Hattie and Kimberly 2007 in Wisniewski et al. And based on the dictionary, Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary, feedback is the transmission of evaluative or corrective information about an action, event, or process to the original or controlling source. And feedback can be either oral or written. Okay, so from strong generativist perspective, corrective feedback is of limited theoretical interest and usefulness to the learners. Why? Because according to the universal grammar, language to be learned is enough to trigger the parameter setting, meaning the feedback doesn't really contribute anything to the language development. But then Long in 1996, in his interaction hypothesis, claims that feedback provides negative evidence which is usable by the learner. Okay, so this negative evidence is involved in the reformulation of the learner's own intended word, which can help them to notice the gaps between the learner's own L2 productions and target forms. And it may be useful to overcome aspects of first language influence. Okay, according to Ranta and Lister 2017, feedback is can help making a contribution to the establishment and proceduralization of declarative knowledge. Because for them, language as a matter of skill acquisition. One form of feedback is the meta-linguistic feedback. It helps making explicit knowledge available in a usable form. Okay, next. Uh, as you can see from this flowchart, the external scaffolding attention where the teacher facilitated the learners, and then they will have the intentionally motivated attention where the students actually do tasks with the language. And then here comes the feedback, which is in the form of explicit knowledge from the teacher. And then from the feedback, they will get explicit memory. And then from the memory, they will do implicit learning where they actually know the gaps from their own production, and then from there they will have implicit memory automatization and abstraction. So there are six types of feedback. The first one is explicit correction. Okay, let's look at the example. We cut the straws into six different widths, and then the teacher will say, "No, David, I want you to use the word length." So here, explicit correction is where the learner is told that they have made an error, and a correct reformulation is provided by the teacher. Like from the studies that were done by Mackie is it? Yeah, where the teacher just corrected it on the spot. And then second type of feedback is recast, where the student will say, "Well, Cinderella was such a simple girl that she never knew what is waiting for her." And then the teacher, without saying anything, just directly said what was waiting for her. Okay, so this one, the teacher reformulates all or part of student utterance minus the error, meaning the teacher doesn't say what is wrong with the sentence. Instead, he or she just straight away give the correct answer. And then next, the third one is clarification requests. Here, the teacher will ask meaning, okay, without any indication of the presence of an error. Like from the example, why does it fly to Korea last year? And then the teacher just straight away, pardon? And then the students will think, oh, maybe there's something wrong. So they just change it into why did he fly to Korea last year? Okay, next. Here is the meta-linguistic feedback. So in meta-linguistic feedback, comments, information, or questions relating to the well-formedness of the learner utterance is given straight away. Like from this example, I went to the train station and picked up my aunt. And then the teacher commented, use past tense consistently. And then the students will reformulate his or her sentence, I went to the train station and picked up my aunt. Next is elicitation. The learner is prompted to reformulate their utterance. Here, uh, the teacher will help them to change the word that they use. For example, here in the example they've given, once upon a time there lives a poor girl named Cinderella. Once upon a time there, and then the student will change there lived a girl. Okay, and then the last one is repetition. The teacher repeats the learner utterance, including any error. Mrs. John traveled a lot last year. Mrs. John traveled a lot last year. Mrs. John traveled a lot last year. Okay, so these are the six types of uh, feedback. Next. Okay, this is from an observation study by Lister and Ranta in 1997 in 4 French immersion classroom in Canadian school. Okay, so the effectiveness of this feedback was assessed through its role in prompting learner repair, whether or not the learner realized that I have made a mistake and then they attempted to repair it. So that is how the effectiveness of feedback is assessed. Okay, in this study, the teachers responded in some way to over 50 students' error. And then from this study, recast is the most popular type of feedback use. Remember recast where the teacher reformulates everything without saying the error. Okay, and then recast and explicit correction is the least successful in eliciting immediate student repairs. Okay, even though it's the most used, most popular type, but then the students cannot uh, understand what is wrong. Why is the teacher saying that? So the students cannot respond immediately. Okay, next. Okay, so other research about feedback is by Russell and Spada in 2006 and Lister and Saito in 2010. They agreed that active oral feedback is generally helpful for learning compared to no feedback at all. Okay, so it helped rather than no feedback. But then, according to Russell and Spada, there is insufficient evidence to argue which types of feedback is better. And according to Lister and Saito, recast is demonstrably less effective for classroom learners than prompts. Okay, so here the prompts is the general terms covering elicitation, clarification requests, and other types of feedback which encourage modified student output. Okay, so here feedback can be classified into two: recast and prompt. Recast is where you straight away just give the right answer, but prompts is where you wait for the students to give their immediate response. Okay, next. Okay, so according to Amar 2006 and Spada 2008, they conducted a study where the one teacher used recast, one teacher used prompts, and one rarely corrected error. So based on this, they confirmed the evidence that corrective feedback contributes helpfully to classroom communicative interaction, which is in line with previous slide research. Yes, corrective feedback is useful in building second language development. But then it is more helpful to the low achieving students. For example, in this research by Amar and Spada, low achieving students benefited significantly more than prompts than recasts. And then prompt low students, where the low achieving using prompt succeeded in catching up with the high students. High students mean they are more proficient than the low students. Okay, so based on this research, we know that feedback is useful in helping students to develop their second language. Next. Okay, other notable research on recast versus prompt, because these are the two types of feedbacks that is used more often in the classroom. Okay, so according to Long, 1996, feedback is a provider of negative evidence and it needs more critical examination. Okay, negative evidence means there is an evidence which is negative, meaning there is something wrong with what you have produced with the language. And then Ellis and Shin in 2006 and Lister and Saito, recast is positive evidence. Positive means because they minus the error, they didn't mention the Arabic. That is why there is positive evidence about target language forms. And also, it depends on the learner's attention and noticing between the recast and on production. That's why students are less likely to give immediate response because they don't know what is wrong. Why is the teacher saying that? So it depends on the learner's attention and notice. This is what I said wrong. Begitu. Lister and Saito 2010 and others, metalinguistic feedback and other different prompts, it provide negative evidence in purer form. Purer form means the error is laid out to you. The teacher tell you what is wrong, and then the student know compared to recast. Okay. Uh, and then in the inadequacy in utterance in conveying meaning, linguistic form without correct reformulation, meanings uh, when they tell you what is wrong, the student sometimes doesn't know how to correct themselves because there is no correct reformulation. The teacher just say what is wrong. Okay. And then the conclusion is the effectiveness of prompts versus recast has to do with the extent to which negative evidence is provided in a noticeable and unambiguous form. Meaning, if you want the recast of prompts to be more effective, then you need to tell your students what is wrong and how to correct it. That's it, the conclusion. Okay, next. Okay, next is the output hypothesis and the role of prompts in corrective feedback. First of all, what is output hypothesis? Output is closely related to the process of language production, meaning input, the knowledge, output is how you use the language. Okay, it is put forward by Merrill Swain in 1980, and then Swain argued that through production, which is output, second language learners are forced to undertake grammatical processing, which in turn help them to develop the syntax and morphology. Meaning, if you use the language and you know how to use it and you know what is wrong, and then it helps you to develop syntax and morphology. Okay, next. Okay, so output hypothesis, there are some claims about the functions of learn output in L2 learning. For example, number one, a noticing and triggering function, or what might be referred to as a consciousness raising role. Okay, because you use it and then the teacher give feedback, the learners become aware of the gaps and problems in the current L2 system. Okay, and then the second is hypothesis testing function. When they use it, it's an opportunity for them to experiment with the language and with new structures and forms. Okay, the sentence will gradually become longer, just like uh, the study from who is that again? Mackie? Is it Mackie? No. Yeah, Mackie. Yeah, development stage for question formation. The presented by Ali just now. Okay, when you use it and then you know that you are wrong and then you correct it yourself, so gradually you will become better. And then the third one is a metalinguistic function. The learners can reflect on, discuss, and analyze these problems explicitly. Okay, based on the feedback that they get. Okay, next. Okay, so what is the role of prompts in corrective feedback? Number one is elicit modified output from learners by McDonough 2005 and McKay 2006. And oh my god, salah. And also promotes learner reformulation, self-repair, and the production of modified output. Yeah, that is the role of prompts. Okay, so it modifies your output from the wrong to correct output. Okay, next. Oh yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Okay, so I will continue. Solve the problem of noticing. So within these two interaction hypothesis and output hypothesis, so there's a kind of interest for researchers. So within here, the interactionists believe that learners will be encouraged to notice the mismatches between features of their own interlanguage production and target language forms in the course of communicative interaction, including meaning, negotiation, and repair. So learners are expected to interpret prompts and recasts as negative evidence, attend to the form and realize the need to reformulate the intended utterance in order to convey the intended message effectively. So meaning they will realize that what they are saying is not the same as they intended. So they don't notice about it. So what they do is they try to reformulate the message properly so that others can understand it. So the amount of attention which the learner is paying to matters of form is expected to influence the extent to which second language input and interaction actually lead to the second language intake. So a lot of researchers go through about this. So they conclude that recasts in second language classrooms are effective if they are accompanied by some additional cue, telling learners that is the form and not only meaning of the utterance that is in the focus. So what happened is this approach they spark a lot of uh, interest within researchers. So they noticed that this uh, input hypothesis or interactions have little they have a quite underdeveloped nature of theories. So Mackey states that the interaction research to date has typically made little reference to the particular model of attention, awareness, and noticing. Rather, these terms have been used in a general way in claims about the utility of interaction. So one person, that is Izumi, kind of made an exception. So Izumi, he states that if relevant input is immediately available, the heightened sense of problematicity during production may cause the learners to process the subsequent input with more focused attention. They may try to examine closely how the target language expresses the intention, which they just had difficulty expressing on their own. So he suggested they where internal representations are not fully formed or uncertain, so learners will be inclined to search for more guidance regarding the immediate linguistic environment. So Izumi also appeals to Van pattern input processing theory to account for learners' inconsistent use of corrective feedback. And he reminds us of that semantic biases which influence the processing of incoming speech and of the limited nature of human processing. So they've done studies also for empirical studies. So studies have also been conducted by interactionist researchers to explore learners' perception of feedback, and in turn, how learners' varying perceptions might affect the uptake of the new second language forms. So these methods include learner journals and written questionnaire and stimulated recall. So stimulated recall is used to get closer to learners' real-time perception of the feedback. So this one is we trying to guess what is in their mind at that time, what are they thinking regarding the feedback. So in a way, once research they done, they done it by filming the learners when they are taking part in some sort of second language interaction. And when shown to them, learners is asked to recall and report what they were thinking about. Okay. So this one is by Mackie again. Use a stimulated recall with a group of 70 learners of English and Italian. And it shows that learners are aware of the feedback relating to lexical and phonological problems. So common types of response to morphosynthetic recasts are illustrated in the following example. So for first example, we have the non-native speaker. It had mixed colors, and then the feedback is it has mixed colors. So the non-native speakers again mixed colors. Aha! And then when they recall back, they see again the tape. So the non-native speaker was thinking nothing. So she just repeat what I said. And then the second example, the non-native speaker. So one man feed for the birds. So the native speaker answered, because again, so one man's feeding the birds, the non-native speaker, the birds. So when they go through again and they recall, when I saw the picture, I thought this is a park and I tried to describe it. So the non-native speaker is trying to describe the park. So he or she use a man feeding the birds. So, and then stimulated recall by Iggy. So Iggy also used stimulated recall in order to examine the extent to which adult learners of second language Japanese second language learners interpreted corrective feedback as relevant to the content and or to the language form. And then she found that around 17% of the recasts were interpreted as relating to the content. So 70% of it were related to the content. And then stimulated recall by Phil. So Phil adopted a different approach to investigate learners' noticing of morphosynthetic recasts by collecting the research evidence during rather than the following communicative event. The learners had to ask questions to complete the task, and their errors received active recasts from the native speakers interlocutors. To investigate whether the learners were noticing the recasts, they were prompted at interval by a signal to repeat what the interlocutor had just said. Okay. So the participants could reproduce high proportion of the recasts which they heard. So they were able to recall and reproduce the recast they heard. However, the accuracy of this repetition depends on three things. First of all, the learner's language level, and then the length of recast. The longer the sentence, maybe the harder for us to remember. And then the number of correction is contained. So the less correction, I think, maybe the higher memory intake within that. So if the recasts were complex and highlighted more than one problem, learners had different difficulty in responding. So the more recast they gain and the more complex it seems, so learners have difficulty in understanding it. So a lower level of recast is better for them. And then the learner's characteristics and engagement. So a study has been conducted to investigate the relationship between the noticing of feedback, the learning of English morphosyntax and vocabulary, as well as the four cognitive characteristics of target learner group, that is phonological memory, working memory, attention control, and analytic ability. So what happened here is the learners are tested for the general proficiency and for knowledge of the target grammar and undergo a series of psychological tests of phonological memory. Finally, afterwards, a post-test and a delayed post-test eliciting knowledge of the target grammar and vocabulary were also administered. So the result of this experiment showed that overall amount of noticing reported by the participant was not significantly related to their second language learning. Okay, that's all from me. So we continue for evaluation on the interaction approach.
Okay, well, the last topic is actually the evaluation on the whole interaction approach. Okay, next. Okay, so first is the scope. Okay, the scope here they are focusing more on the input negotiations of both form and meaning and productions of the learner. And then the scope is also limited to the learner's use of particular words or target morphosynthetic forms and to certain discourse, okay, being formed by the interlocutor, for example, recast prompts or metalinguistic. Next. Okay. Also, for the researchers in the IHETCH, they are aware of claiming the status of a theory where they refer hypothesis, and more recently, they are changing it into approach. Okay. So the interactional behaviors that they have explored in the IHETCH include the modification of input by negotiation, noticing new language features, provisions of feedbacks and of prompts, and also opportunities for learners to produce modified input based on the feedback events. And the morphosyntactic features that they have looked on is articles, questions, past tense formation, and also plurals. Next. Okay, so based on the interaction approach, they looking at language as from the early version of interaction hypothesis, they're looking at language broadly on the Chomskyan view, where we all have the innate language faculty or LID, language acquisition device. But then from 1990s forward, they're tacitly moving away from the Chomskyan view. One of the researchers argued that with NC Ellis in 2009, functionalist view of language was most appropriate and relevant to interaction hypothesis, but it is still not widely adopted. Instead, they identify particular morphosynthetic features in subsystems. So they studied how these were learned, and it is somewhat isolated from the bigger picture. Also, there are little discussion on implications for interlanguage development. That is why the view of language is still mm, not really clear yet. But then they all agree that oral interaction is a sequence of functionally discrete and quantifiable discourse modes or strategies. Next. So in interaction approach learning, uh, they are looking at learning as devising ways of monitoring learner attention. Okay, and then also looking at the second language processing capacity as mediating factors which would affect the availability of second language input for intake and acquisition. And also they're looking at learning as um, learners acquiring words and morphosynthetic features when feedback was given. Okay, next. Because interaction approach view on the language learner, they are typically an individual classroom learner. They have this basic assumption where they think that learner is uniformly motivated to attend to second language input, and they should engage actively in prescribed activities and tests. And in most studies, this learner shared common learning route, and also look they look more into the edge language proficiency level and also the increasingly working memory capacity, the psycholinguistic aspect lah. At least Enshin 2006 pointed out that learners' orientation to the learning context may affect their engagement with significant ways, which is how they mediate the influence of feedback and elicitation. Okay, next. So overall conclusion, IH successfully demonstrated many interconnection between aspects of second language interaction and second language learning. Okay, so interaction equals to learning, like that. Okay, and then learning partly derived from early work on classroom feedback. So this classroom feedback has a clear implications for classroom practice. However, there is a need for closer integration with other research and theoretical strands such as the selective nature of learner attention and noticing, just as presented earlier, and the continuing difficulties in predicting which second language features will prove most amenable to interactionist treatments. Okay, which one is can be treated. Okay, like that. And then also they are looking into second language processing. Okay, by looking into this, it would be an important aspect for them to change that status from approach to actually a theory. Okay, so that's all for our today discussion.